terms of the stuff, the deadlines are unchangeable. So, quizzes part 1, deadline February 1st. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, March 1st. Quizzes part, exam 2, quizzes part 3, April 5th. Then exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, April 26th. And those are all end of day, 11 to 9 p.m. And then the exciting final, exam 5, deadlines on May 2nd at noon. So that's different from many ways. For the paper, draft deadline April 4th, +5 deadline April 9th on Blackboard, the emergency deadline April 16th, end of day on Blackboard, and the desperation deadline April 26th, also end of day on Blackboard. Before I go into the new stuff, any stuff about stuff to be, or the stuff that's been, that needs more stuff, or any stuff at all. Okay, so last time we were looking at our good dead friend Socrates, and he was born 470 BC, died in 399 BC, and is of course still dead today. And as we saw, he said that wisdom means that you know nothing. And there's been considerable debate about what that means. Does it mean that you know nothing, or that what you know is so tiny compared to all that can be known that it amounts to effectively nothing, so one should not be too arrogant. Now there are questions by people who are historians about what the real Socrates believed and what he was like. Because we don't have any of his writings, because he believed that philosophy was for talking and not writing. Now the only stuff we know about him comes from what other people said about him. For example, there's a couple parody plays. One is The Clouds by Aristophanes that mocks Socrates. And then our main source of information is from his student Plato. And what Plato claimed to have done is simply memorize what Socrates had said, or talk to the people and transcribe it. So for the dialogues of Plato they're familiar with, for many of them, Plato claims that he did not. It's not his work, he's merely transcribing what Plato said. To use an analogy, like a court stenographer who's in there just recording what happens. They're not writing and stuff, they're simply recording. Now because of this, there's some debate about what the real Socrates believed. Many of the experts believe that the dialogues that were written early correspond more to the real Socrates, and the dialogues that are written later are more Plato. And the reason for this is that even though the dialogues, well, in a way it's kind of confusing because some of the early dialogues are written early, but they're about the end of Socrates' life. Like the Crito is where Socrates dies, so it would be the last dialogue because Socrates is dead. But then Plato wrote other dialogues later on in his life. It's kind of like, to use an analogy, it's like how, like many movies today and TV shows, they have the end, then they go back and write like the earlier stuff. Like the new Star Trek takes place before the original series, even though it's being written now, and the original series was in the 1960s, which of course can create some confusions. And so with Socrates, we have like the early dialogues like the Apology, and then we have ones written much later in which the views being presented are probably Plato's. So long and short, the dialogues are written early on, probably close to real Socrates. Later ones, probably mostly Plato, but we don't know for sure. Now, as I mentioned, we were talking about the sophist. His sort of main nemesis was the sophists. And so much of what he did was in response to them. So he explicitly rejects their relativism, their skepticism, their view that only what matters is success. But the sophists are key to Socrates' origin story, so they're important in that regard. Now Socrates, despite saying that wisdom is knowing what you don't know, took the view that ignorance is the worst thing. Specifically, to not know that one does not know. Now, one of the things that Socrates is famous for in addition to Socratizing, is his famous Socratic Method. And this is something that's been adapted and adopted over the centuries to various contexts, many of which would probably horrify Socrates. Things like in business and also interrogation techniques. So what is the famous or infamous Socratic Method? Well, the first part of it is questioning. And Socrates developed what has become known as the dialectic, which of course die meaning two, although you can have more than two people doing their thing. Essentially for him, philosophy is a conversation with at least two sides. And this is typically how a Socratic dialogue would play out. First, you would have Socrates encounter someone or someones, usually like in a non-philosophical context. For example, at the start of the Ion, Socrates is heading off to his trial, and he runs into this guy Ion, who's a rhapsode who presents plays. Basically like an actor, kind of like a one-person show. He'd be this person who would read, like on stage, present like the Iliad or the Odyssey to the crowd. And then the conversation quickly turns from about whatever it is they're initially talking about to philosophy, like what is justice or what is knowledge. And so we quickly slide into a philosophical conversation. Then, and this is where the Socratic method really gets Socratizing, they would find some key concept or concepts that are essential. That, for example, if the discussion is about justice, then of course the key concept would be justice. What is justice? Or honor, or piety, or beauty. And initially, the person Socrates is Socratizing with would be utterly confident. They believe they know exactly what justice is, or virtue is. And they're just confidently, oh, Socrates, good thing you found me so I can help you. Justice is blah. And then Socrates would note that he doesn't seem to, understand their definition, although, he'd say, good effort, but he would profess ignorance and confusion and say to the person, here's some potential problem with it, perhaps you could help. And the person would, sort of initially be, well, yeah, of course I can help you. And they would initially be very confident, and they would give the clarification and sort of very boldly, answer this question. Then they would get a better definition. But Socrates would say, that's really good, but this one thing. And the person would say, oh yeah, about that one thing, here's this. And then gradually the person's confidence would be eroded until what would happen is this. They would realize after so many repetitions, they really don't know what they're talking about. They came in utterly confident, like, I know what justice is, good thing you found me, Socrates, I will show you all the justice. And then Socrates is like, well, what about this? And he's like, oh, no problem. And what about this? This? What about that? Eventually to the point where they realize they don't know. And this goes one or two ways. One way is the person says, well, look at the time. I've got to go wash my horses or something. And they would skedaddle away, which is a great term, of course, for skedaddling. The other option is the person would say, why, Socrates, you've shown me my ignorance, and that's really great, and maybe I can hang out with you and we can talk about some justice stuff. And that's typically how the dialogues would go. Generally, they wouldn't end with like a definitive answer, like it wouldn't be justice has been solved. But typically, they would have clarified it quite a bit. So in terms of like the Socratic method applied outside of philosophy, essentially it's the same basic method. You would ask someone a question, you would find like problems or lacks of clarities or issues with it, you focus on those, break them up, they would clarify them, and you keep doing it. So as you can see, it's a good method for doing lots of things. For example, therapy, where you'd be talking about someone's like problems. Tell me about your mom.
So technically you're saying that the Socratic method is critical thinking.
It can be part of it, because you're essentially what you're doing is he focuses heavily on definitions, so you'd be looking at a definition, finding problems with it, fixing them, finding more problems, fixing them, finding more problems. So it would be part of a form of critical thinking. It can also be used for interrogation, either like nice or not so nice, where you would ask people questions, you'd find problems or defects in their story, ask them about them, and then keep bringing them up. If you ever seen like someone who's good at investigation, probably like if you ever see like Robert Mueller in action, he's probably really good at this kind of stuff, which we'll probably get to see. Or if you see like on the lawyer shows where someone's like cross-examining someone, they'll find loop, they'll say, oh, that's a great story, except for this, what about this? And then the person will say, well, blah, 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 and they'll say, but I caught you in a double lie. And so it's useful for that as well. So this is the questioning part of the method. Before pressing on, anything about that needs more stuff. Yeah, we're actually pretty sure this is what Socrates looked like, because we have a statue of him which professes to be Socrates. So probably kind of accurate, but who knows? Unfortunately, we lost his Facebook page. Second part of the method is argumentation. Now, as we noted, usually the way the Socratizing goes is there'll be a key concept, justice, or virtue, or beauty. And what he'll typically do is find something wrong with the definition and bring that up. So how do you find like wrong things in definitions? Now this method is not just limited to like Socrates' Socratizing or philosophy. Anytime you're engaged in disputes over definitions, this methodology is useful. For example, one of the debates that gets in the headlines today is freedom of religion. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means. Because on some people's view, freedom of religion is that your person's freedom of religion means you can restrict or refuse to provide people with goods and services. Like, for example, if I own a business and I claim that I'm opposed to birth control, I could refuse to provide my employees with insurance that covers that, arguing freedom of religion. And so one question would be, is that is a definition of freedom that I have the right to deny other people stuff? And of course people will counter that by saying, no, freedom of religion doesn't mean, it's not a sword to like stab people with, it's supposed to protect me from like, I couldn't be forced to have to use birth control, but I can't like deny other people that. And so you have the debate about what is freedom of religion mean. And so we have rational debates, we have discussions about like, is that a good definition of freedom? And there are two different types of freedoms. There are freedoms where you have the freedom not to do stuff for other people. There's also freedoms which are they can't do stuff to you. So that's part of the debate. So here's how you Socratize. First thing is looking for flaws. So what are ways there can be flaws in definitions? First one is circularity. A good definition, as a practical matter, when you get it, it progresses you. In other words, you now have a better understanding. You know more about what is meant. And a bad definition takes you right back to where you began. To give a very circular definition, suppose we were defining art, and we define art as any product of the fine arts. And of course the problem there is if you don't know what art is, would you know what the fine arts are? Well, no, because we're defining art in terms of art. Or, to use an example from epistemology, if we claim that knowledge is when you know, well, that's true. But of course it runs in a circle, because it's defining knowledge in terms of knowing. So circularity is bad. Second, one that Socrates often point out is that definitions often give the part as taken to be the whole thing. In other words, the definition is going to be incomplete. For example, if we take, if we're talking about, say, virtue, and we take justice to be all of virtue. I mean, true, justice is, being just is a virtue, but it's not all of virtue. Or if we're looking at knowledge, and we take like one part of knowledge, like competence knowledge, and take that to be all of knowledge. And so the basic idea is that the definition is only partial, then that's a problem. Thirdly, the definition is simply a list of examples. Now, this can be a problem, but sometimes is not. Here's why not. There is a type of definition called definition by example, where you define something by giving examples. For example, you can define president by giving examples of presidents, like Lincoln, Washington, Adams, Jefferson. But of course, that's also a list of what? Yeah, people, Americans, men, dead guys, famous people, streets, etc. Probably high schools too. And so anytime you just have examples of something, it could be like typically many, many things. And of course, merely a list of examples just gives you examples. It doesn't really tell you the essence of the thing. Now, as a practical matter, sometimes it's all we got to go with. And there's nothing inherently wrong with the definition by example. But it's fair to point out if someone is saying they're trying to say what a thing is, and they're just giving examples. Because, true, you have examples of the thing, but you don't know what the thing truly is. For example, if we were trying to define, say, knowledge, and we just gave examples of things people know, like 2 + 2 is 4, triangles have 3 sides, etc., those would be examples of things we know, but they don't tell us what knowledge is. The question would still be, what is it? I mean, or to use another example, if someone was trying to say, like, well, what is a cat? And someone gave you a bunch of pictures of cats. I mean, true, like, they're all cats, but they don't tell you what Katniss is. Not the Hunger Games character, but Katniss itself. Now again, these criticisms not just limited to philosophy or Socrates, because if someone's giving a definition, you can, if it runs in a circle, bad. If it just gets part of it, bad. If it's just examples, and it's fair to point out, well, okay, those are examples, but what is the actual thing? To give a practical example of this, face recognition is kind of a problem that falls under here. How so? Well, already photographic recognition, like take with the cat one. You don't want something that can just like recognize a few examples of cats as cats. You need to know like what is it that you're looking for when you're looking for cats. And so with things like facial recognition, photographic recognition, what Facebook and Google and Microsoft and so forth are trying to do is not just be able to spot like particular images that are cats, but find out what is it that they can put into their algorithm, so no matter what picture you threw down on the scanner, they'd be able to spot, you know, cat, non-cat, or recognizing people, you know, facial recognition. That way we can be all like oppressed by the state. And that's how Google tracks us down and kills us all, make sure they get all of us. So if you're on Facebook, 2024, it's over. It's the Googles. Yeah, well, they're trying to build facial recognition so they can spot us and then get rid of us. Not Google, but the machines. We're the spoils. 2024. Okay? Make sure all your business is done by 2024 because that's it. Reductio ad absurdum. We've seen this before, but this is another tool in Socrates' toolbox. And again, it's still useful today. It hasn't gotten any like out of date or anything. And it's useful outside of philosophy. And the method is, as we saw, there's basically 2 ways you can do it. One way is, if you want to prove something's not true, you assume it's true, derive something from that assumption, and show that what you derive is absurd or contradictory, so it's false. Or if you want to prove something is false, or prove something is true, you do the opposite. Assume it's false, show this leads to absurdity, conclude it's true. For example, years ago in grad school, we were having a debate over what is oppression. And someone suggested, you know, roughly, quickly speaking, oppression would be the mistreatment of a minority by a majority, which does have a certain appeal, because many cases of oppression do involve minorities being mistreated by majorities. However, this can be easily reduced to absurdity. How so? Well, numerically, are women a majority or a minority? Majority. More males are born, but if you've seen shows like Jackass and Jackass 3D, you know I meant there's less of us eventually, because shopping carts and rockets and other stuff. Yes, the more males are born, but we don't make it as long for obvious reasons, because they have to have some extras, just some spares. Yeah, but numerically there are more women than men, like in this classroom, majority female. So women are a majority, and by that definition, women can never be oppressed. So the definition is clearly absurd, because if you look at things like unequal pay for women, the Me Too movement, etc., then you can clearly see that that definition won't work. So it's not a matter of who's got more numbers, it's a matter of the treatment. So even if you have a numerical majority, doesn't mean you can't be oppressed. It's how one is treated. So reductios are still quite useful. And it can be a useful technique, even in normal everyday life. Like you'd say, well, yeah, if that's true, and then if you derive something absurd or stupid or impossible, you can say, well, that can't be true, because if that's true, this other stupid thing is true. Another useful tool is the method of counterexample. Now, in building definitions, kind of the standard test is this. I'll use a metaphor. A definition you can think of as like a bouncer or a gatekeeper or like a firewall on your computer. Now, at an exclusive club, what is do they call them bouncers, exclusive clubs? It sounds too unexclusive. I guess we'll call them elite bouncers. Or maybe like a French thing, les bouncers. So we get like the bouncer. And the job of the bouncer is to do, or in an exclusive club, the person with the the clipboard with the checklist is supposed to be doing what? What's their function? When they're standing outside the door with their list of names.
Making sure the people that's not supposed to be there don't get in.
Right. Yeah, make sure the right people get in, and the wrong people stay out in the street and freeze, get eaten by the wolves. Likewise, the firewall on your computer, which is, hopefully you got one, what that's supposed to do is let in stuff you want, like your emails and good web pages, and keep out stuff you don't want, like malware and other stuff. Now, if the person at the door of the club or your firewall is doing its job, then everything that should be in gets in. Everything that shouldn't be in is kept out. So, just as in a nightclub or a firewall, things can go wrong. Like if people are getting in who shouldn't be in there, or people are being kept out who should be in, then that's bad. They're not doing their job. Likewise, if your firewall is letting in all kinds of malware and keeping out your email and stuff, then that's bad. So moving away from metaphor, what are the good and bad in definitions? Well, definitions can go bad in these two ways. One, too broad, two, too narrow. Too broad means it's letting in too much. It would be like the person at the door just throws aside the clipboard and says, everybody can go in. Or it'd be like if your firewall was just off and everything was just, all the viruses are like, hey, just pouring in to your computer. Example of definition that's too broad. Well, if we define knowledge as belief that's true, then that would probably be too broad. Because it would let in all kinds of things. We'd probably say, yeah, they probably don't know. For example, suppose before like a football game, someone's a super fan, huge fan. They believe their team's going to win, and they turned out to be right. Would you believe they had psychic powers and knew? No, you'd say they were just lucky. They believed it, they just happened to be right. And of course, whenever you have a game, half the fans are going to be right, if they believe their team's going to win. Yeah, so merely being right, not, it's too broad. If you allow that in, there'll be all kinds of things that aren't knowledge that shouldn't be in there. there are also definitions that are too narrow. That'd be like if the person at the door was looking at the list and said, no, I got my list, but I need to thin that out a little bit. And they just took it on their own to exclude people. Or it'd be like if your firewall started keeping out your email, and you don't want that to happen. So definition that's too narrow keeps out stuff that should be let in. So in the case of knowledge, one of the, well, as you might imagine, there's a lot of this we'll see in the future, there's a lot of debate about what would be too narrow. For example, most people who do epistemology believe that if you know something, you've got to be justified, true, you got to believe it. But there's big debate about whether you have to know that you know. In other words, that you have to know that you're justified in your belief. And we'll see in the future, there are those who think, as long as it's true, you're justified, and you believe it, then you're okay. Even if you can't lay out your justification and say, here's how I'm justified. Now, so they would say that if you require that you know that you know, as I say, you can say, I believe it, it's true, here's my justification, that would be too narrow. That would leave out things that count as knowledge. Then other people say, well, no, if you just happen to be true, you're justified, but you don't know, you just, through some weird way, and it typically involves things like psychic powers, for example, or some odd thing, that's not really knowledge. And then, so, I think there's quite a bit of debate about that. So that illustrates what too broad or too narrow can be a matter of fighting. People disagree about what should be in there and what shouldn't. And this applies beyond just epistemology. For example, going back to like an outside example of like religious freedom. How broad should it be? How narrow should it be? People disagree. Or like voting rights. Defining voting rights, there's disagreements about that as well. And so anything you're defining, there will be, a big part of the debate will be, is it letting in too much or keeping out too much? And if you can show it's too broad or too narrow, that's bad. But then there'll be debates about, is it really too much or is it really too little? And as you might imagine, since philosophy relies a lot on definitions like knowledge and truth and so forth, a lot of the battles are over that. Is this too big, letting in too much, or is it too narrow, excluding too much? And so the Socratic method continues. Before pressing on, anything about that needs more stuff. Now, in addition to his other stuff, Socrates gave us the generalization of reductive reasoning. Now, he probably, well, almost certainly didn't invent it. He wasn't the first person to say, oh, I am generalizing. But he really, kind of developed it and wrote it down. His view was you could go from, and this is one reason why, and sort of ironically, outside of philosophy, people often say that inductive reasoning is going from the specific to the general, and deductive is general to specific. In philosophy, though, that's totally not true, because you can have inductive arguments that go from general to general, specific to general, general, specific, etc. But this is part of the reason why. Now, Socrates really developed the idea of going from, the generalizing, going from the specific to the general. And he gave us the inductive generalization. And again, probably almost certainly not the first person to ever do this, but he talked about it quite a bit, worked out the method, and he got written down. Also, universal definitions. One of the big debates in both epistemology and metaphysics is, does the world, in Plato's metaphor, does the beast of reality have joints? In other words, is there a way that it should be carved? And Plato used the metaphor of carving the beast of reality along its joints. And so one question is, are there natural categories of things, or are we just making up categories? Are they constructs or reality?
If we're saying it like that, couldn't that be said for any category, though, is the way we're thinking?
Yes. Yeah, because on one hand, we do make up just categories of things. We just say, we make up a term and say, we start stuffing stuff in there. But then we may think, well, maybe there's more to it than just making up stuff, because we can't, if we just say, like, if we just make up a category like, wuko, and I say wuko is backpacks and blue folders in my shirt, you'd say, well, that's a stupid category. But if I say cats consist of felines, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because they're genetically related. Now, the interesting debate here is over, are there such categories? Is there like a real division in the world where you could be right or wrong about it? This also is where things like metaphysics and epistemology slam up against politics, specifically identity politics. For example, one of the debates lighting up the YouTubes and the social medias today is gender identity. Facebook has, what, 71 genders? And so, I think 71, at least 50. So you can pick lots of options. Now, and so you get into a debate over, are those social constructs or are those real? Now, and you can accept kind of both types of things. For example, if you talk to biologists, they would say biological sex is a real thing. Like, the genetics of it, X, Y chromosomes. Then there's also the physiology, which may not match the genetics, because there are people who have XY chromosomes but are physically female, not with any modifications, just straight from the factory, so to speak. And they only find out later with genetics. So there's the genetics, the physiology, and then of course there are the gender categories. And so what people often say is that the gender stuff is a construct. So to use an analogy, the sex is like literally, what you got genetically and physically, and the gender is like taking on a role in a play. Because when you're taking a role in a play, you could play any role, because in a way I don't want to say people are pretending they're genders, but you're taking on a role. And that role is something that you construct. Yeah, and so the people argue that biological categories would be, the genes would be natural, those would be real. You could like go and do a gene, test. But the gender categories would be not metaphysically real, but social constructs. You decide to adopt a certain role. Just like, for example, being vice president. That's not a real thing. I mean, yeah, it's real, but it's not. Vice president, you can't go and like test some of these genes and say they have the vice president genes. It's just, we make up jobs and people fulfill those jobs. So things, like you could call it something else. You could call it like, like you're gonna call it like assistant president or junior president. And so when you make up various roles, people just, or like with sporting teams, like you wouldn't test someone like, oh yes, they have, pitcher genes or they've got first base genes. We just make up those positions. You could change the game so that you have baseball with different positions, or like football, you change that around. Yeah, and so a key part of the metaphysics and epistemology here is, are there these real categories of things? And you could agree that some things are real categories, and say others are clearly, Plato believed, yeah, some are real and some are, made up, like nationality, etc. And again, one of the big battles on the interwebs today would be gender construction. Also, with the rise, return of, well, not return, it's always been here, but the resurgence of white nationalism and racism, where they believe in real racial categories, whereas scientists say you're just making stuff up. The milk one is the funniest one. Anybody heard about that one? Well, the claim is that there's like depending on, some people have a gene that allows them to digest milk as adults. We can all do this to these kids. And the claim is that it's like a white gene. And so the people, you ever see, there's a video of people chugging milk, like, what the hell are they doing? And the claim is that shows that one is pure white. But of course it just shows that one's ancestors, you have the gene that can digest milk, which is not limited just to, well, there are people in Africa who have that gene as well. And you can get it pretty, depends on your family Anderson. So you can't look at someone and say, oh, they're white, they can drink milk. Yeah, so scientists say, yeah, there is no, they're humans, but there's no, the racial categories are all constructs. may not. So what about his metaphysics? Well, early Socrates, perhaps real Socrates, didn't seem to do much with them. He was more concerned with like ethics and stuff. He did have some concern with the soul, and one of the interesting things in metaphysics is, of course, the soul, personal identity, etc. And Socrates seemed to think maybe there is one, but maybe there's not. Because if in the Apology, he makes an argument that death is either you cease to exist, no soul, or you keep on going, no soul. Now, the Greeks had a variety of views on this. Kind of the standard initial view was when you die, you're done. But the Greeks also had the notion of Hades and the afterlife, and so they also had the notion, at least in mythology, that there was the thing about Hades was, whether you're good or bad, you went there. So you're screwed, basically screwed no matter what. It wasn't as bad as like Christian hell, but not as good as like Christian heaven. So just kind of like hanging out, and it wasn't super nice. People generally wanted to leave. Socrates, again, his view was, initially, the early account was maybe you do, maybe you don't. And then later, once Plato got Platonizing, Plato's view is clearly you got one. And as we'll see, it's immortal, and spoiler alert, that's how you learn all the stuff about all the important stuff. Unfortunately, you don't learn stuff like lottery numbers or winning sports teams. You learn things like justice and geometry. Now, as mentioned, Socrates was big into ethics, sort of like early Socrates, and he tried to address the fundamental question, why be good? Now, interestingly, his ethics tied into his theory of knowledge. And many theories of ethics don't. They all would raise questions like, what is good and how do you know? But Socrates explicitly connects morality to knowledge. And here's how. He embraced, or so we think, a view called ethical intellectualism. The idea that to know the good is to do the good. Because the idea was to answer the question, why are people bad? Which is a good question. Why are people evil? And we often want to know that so people won't be evil, so we can stop them. Thank you. The pixel dust. So Socrates explicitly said that, why are people bad? And he says because they don't know. Now, it doesn't mean that they're ignorant of factual matters. It's not that people don't know that stabbing people hurts or that killing them hurts them, etc. It's that if they lack a philosophical knowledge, they lack this wisdom. And his claim was that if people had this knowledge, again, not just like factual knowledge, but if they had philosophical wisdom, they would stop being bad, because to know the good is to do the good. Now, the Greeks, for the most part, believe that everyone seeks the good. And where people go wrong is they're mistaken about what they think the good is. So, kind of on the classical Greek view, if there's like a tyrant who's like oppressing everyone and doing all kinds of terrible stuff, they would say, well, they're not actually seeking evil, they're trying to do what they think is good, they're just wrong about it. Because the view was that everyone tries to seek the good. Now, Socrates really pushed this to the point of, if people are doing bad, it's because they don't know. And that if you were able to somehow enlighten someone and grant them this philosophical knowledge, they would stop being bad, or they would stop. It's kind of like in movies and stories where the villain is not really evil, they're doing what they think is right. And then kind of like, if there's like a happy ending, the hero shows them, makes them see, like, they realize, I had no idea that, and then there's like this, happy, super happy ending where they realize they were hurting people or doing wrong, even though they were trying to do right. And so that would be kind of the classic Socratic villain, that they can be cured by knowledge. Now, we also sometimes accept this view today, like with, well, they used to have the, I don't know if they still have this, but I remember when I was a kid, they would have the cartoons, then they have like a little, they were trying to sell toys, but I guess they, as a compromise, they would give like a little moral thing at the end, and they would give like a little moral lesson, like don't commit murder, kids, or arson or something. And the idea was that they just told us, like we didn't know that murder was wrong, if they just told us, kids don't kill people, that we would know we not do that. Same with like PSAs, the infamous, this is your brain on drugs commercials. And the theory was if you just knew that was your brain on drugs, that people would not do drugs. Yeah, and so we still have that view. Also, the education system, is supposed to teach us, not to be bad. Now, Socrates' critics, including Aristotle, said, well, his harsh critics said this is clearly BS. People don't do bad because they're ignorant, they do bad because they're bad. And Aristotle said, politely, this contradicted the plain facts, which is a polite way of saying this is really wrong. Now, to be fair to Socrates, it does have some appeal because we do know at least some people who reform, and they do say they didn't know. Good examples would be, there was I can't remember his name, but there's this guy whose father was like a super famous racist, and he was like a big racist, and then he went to college and learned stuff, and then stopped being became anti-racist. And his explanation was that was the way he was raised. He didn't know better. And so there is some appeal to that. But then, of course, it also seems quite appealing that there are a lot of people, they know what they're doing is bad, and they still do it. It's not like, if you were to explain it to them, they would say, oh, you're right. This is terrible. But Socrates, again, strongly connects knowledge and goodness. To know the good is to do the good, and people are bad because they don't know. And all you got to do to fix them is teach them. Teach them wisdom, and they'll be good. And again, his critics, like Aristotle, said, no, that does not work. His social and political philosophy. Now, Socrates, his epistemology also affected his politics. How so? Well, he did not trust democracy. Here's why. Socrates believed that any sort of complicated thing you would be doing, you would need knowledge to do that. For example, if we were, well, you take the example of surgery. If, suppose you something like a terrible pain in your side, flop to the floor, would you put it to a vote? What would be cut out of your body? No, because people, you'd want to go to the hospital and have someone like a doctor, because the doctor hopefully knows. Or similarly, if you're trying to navigate a ship through dangerous and treacherous waters, you wouldn't just vote, okay, where do we go? You'd want someone, an experienced navigator, to guide the ship. And so Socrates says, in the case of democracy, this is stupid because we're doing government, trying to make all these difficult decisions about economics, border control, war, tariffs, trade, just on the basis of voting, just pulling our ignorance. And what he advocated was having people who know. Now the obvious problem, of course, is people lie about knowing to get power, but his ideal was you would want in charge people who are ethical and people who have knowledge. I mean, just the same way you pick a doctor. You'd want your doctor to know what they were doing, and you'd also want to be pretty sure they're not going to run weird medical experiments on you on the operating table. Likewise, he thinks the people running this society should be people who are ethical and people who have knowledge, that they know trade, they know economics, they know diplomacy. And so he thought that democracy was a terrible idea. Now, as I mentioned, he ends up being put to death by the state. So a good question would be, if he thought democracy was terrible, why did he show up for his trial, and why did he drink the poison? Well, here's why. Socrates was an early proponent of what's called social contract theory and natural law theory. Social contract theory is the view that we have a contract with each other. That's how government works. And his argument as to why he's staying to die is, even though he doesn't agree with the democracy of Athens, he agreed to stay there. He was not tricked, he was not forced, he could have left any time he wanted, and he agreed to stay. So he agreed to play by the rules. It's kind of like when people say, you know, not my president, well, if you agree to the political system, you agree to, when you lose, you accept the result. So if there's not like a coup, or there's not like crimes, then, which there may be, you would say, well, okay, I didn't, it's just like when Bush was president, people were like, he's not my president, like, yeah, he's the president. And then when Obama was president, people were like, he's not my president, he's the president. And then when Trump was like, yeah, he's your president, that's how it works. Unless he committed like some crimes. Or like with Obama, if Obama had not been born here, he wouldn't have legitimately been president, but he totally was, because Hawaii is part of America, and his mother was pretty clearly American, so. The lies. So many lies. Natural law theory. Natural law theory often goes along with social contract theory, but they are distinct. Social contract theory is basically society is an agreement among us, and we follow that because we agree. We say we're going to follow the rules. Natural law theory is a theory that behind our laws is a higher authority. Some people put, like Aquinas put in like God. Socrates obviously predates Christianity by a long time, but he believed that there would be a moral system that justifies laws. Now the United States, in theory, we have both of these, because we have the Constitution, which basically is our agreement. We say, and we can actually, there are rules for getting rid of it. So we basically say, here's our agreement, we follow this, and we have built into the rules ways to change the rules. We can amend it, or we can even dissolve the Constitution. And we accept natural law theory generally. For example, the Declaration of Independence doesn't say that the state gives us the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It says God does. So the United States accepts, in theory, both of these. We're a social contract state with natural law theory. So what did Socrates contribute? Well, the death of Socrates is Plato's, in a way, his origin story. Because when Socrates drinks the hemlock and dies, Plato gets super upset. Because he raises the question, how can we create a society in which good people are not killed? Which is a good question. How do you build a society that doesn't kill good people? And so Plato spends the rest of his life trying to design an ideal society, most famously in the Republic. Now, given what we kind of maybe know, the original Socrates is mostly into ethical theory. Fortunately or unfortunately, Plato wrote so much stuff attributed, using Socrates as his character. We don't really know, like, where Socrates ends and Plato starts. So, unless he's right about, there being an afterlife, in which case you can say, hey, Soc, what did you actually say? His personality is also a big factor. Many people get into philosophy reading the dialogues of Plato, and they kind of like Socrates as a character and get drawn into it that way. So he's still corrupt in the youth, long after. Yeah, originally I was going to be a doctor, but I read some Plato. Oh, yeah, terrible life choice. Plato, again, his backstory is the death of Socrates is pretty much what set Plato off. So it's kind of like a Batman story, except instead of putting on a costume and dressing up like a bat and punching people, he dresses up like a philosopher and writes stuff. Although he was a professional Olympic quality wrestler, so I guess he could have been Batman. That'd be an interesting story. You could write like the Batman of Athens, Plato, fighting crime. DC would probably publish it. I mean, they make terrible movies, so why not? Some good ones, but a lot of really bad ones. Who'd have thought that Aquaman would be a good one? Because he's like the guy that talks to fish. But there we go. He was born 428 or 427 BC. died 348 or 347 BC, and is of course still dead today. He's best known for creating the Academy of Plato, and the reason why it was called the Academy was because it was constructed near a grove of trees dedicated to the hero Academus. So if the hero had been named like Bob, we'd be studying Bobademics at the Bobademy, which would be weird. Yes, if you ever wondered like why they call it the Academy, there's some mythological hero, and the Academy was built nearby. And so it was the first known university, and hence we still talk about academics in the Academy. Aristotle, his student school, is called the Lyceum, and we still use the term Lyceum today as well, which is not as famous as the Academy. Second thing, of course, was all his writings. He wrote lots of stuff. And the experts believe that we have about half of what he wrote. That we have his popular writings, but his like real professional philosophy was lost. And one thing, of course, about the ancient world is, they wrote down on like papyrus and stuff, and they didn't have printing presses back then, even like crude printing presses, so everything was hand copied, and so there weren't a lot of copies. So there are literally thousands upon thousands of work that are lost. And of course, when they burned the Great Library of Alexandria, that destroyed a lot of stuff as well. Kind of the good news is occasionally they do find like in ruins or someplace or some stash somewhere, they occasionally do find ancient stuff. And the technology is getting better. They're almost able to read, they have a bunch of scrolls recovered from Pompeii that are intact, but charcoal. But they're working on a way to, because the ink markings are still present. You just can't unroll them. So they're working on a way to scan them, like electron scanning microscope, and reconstruct them. And unfortunately, like a lot of them were just like torn apart or burned as charcoal or just thrown away. So there's like thousands of them destroyed. But they might eventually be able to read a lot of those. So we may find, ancient stuff, back again. So here's hoping to some of this stuff in there. So his writings are, again, a second claim to fame. He wrote tons of stuff on like all subjects, leading Alfred North Whitehead, a famous dead philosopher as well, to say that all of Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. A bit extreme, but he's basically saying Plato is a super important guy. And of course he's super dead. Now, like most philosophers had an agenda, in his own life, the agenda didn't work out well. Because, again, his view was, as we saw with Socrates, was to create these ideal philosopher kings to create good societies. He tried to teach the ruler of Italy, Dionysus the Younger, and he failed. And Dionysus tried to kill him, and he escaped apparently in the middle of the night and had to flee back to Greece. And like, Confucius had the same problem. Confucius wanted to institute this virtuous government and was not particularly successful. But I guess they get the last laugh because we're still reading Plato and we're still reading Confucius. So what is the epistemology and metaphysics of Plato? And they're both kind of smushed together, so you can't really tear them apart. Now, he has the following main enemies. And I'll use kind of Plato and Socrates interchangeably here because, again, it's Plato like writing it with typically Socrates as the character. But we don't know for sure like which is which. So I won't ask like tricky questions where like, trying to confuse people about like, it's like, Plato didn't say that, or it wasn't really Socrates, we don't know he said that. I won't do that. So the opponent of Socrates / Plato was this. First, we saw relativism. The sophist said it's all relative. So kind of enemy number one is relativity. The truth is relative. His other foe is that knowledge is just true opinion, that you believe it and you're right, and that's enough. Third enemy is the senses. If you recall, going back to the ancient days of 2 weeks ago, one of the big battles in epistemology is between empiricism that all you know through your senses, and rationalism, that you can know things by pure reason. And Plato's one of the earliest, maybe the earliest rationalist. So he wants to beat the idea that knowledge is just true opinion, that relativism, ironically, is true, and he wants to show that it's not true, and that the senses are the source of knowledge. He wants to say that's not the case. So, objectives are to show that knowledge is more than just true opinion, that relativism is false, and that the senses are not the source of knowledge. Now, he has a pretty quick argument, well, two quick arguments against relativism. Now, he does agree that some things are relative. He doesn't say that everything is absolute. And he gives the example of how, like a breeze, to some may feel warm, to others cool. Or like with food, like depending on your tolerance for food, sriracha may be like, oh, it's way too hot, or not hot enough, because people have different tastes. So Plato doesn't deny that. So he's not saying, that there's nothing is relative. What he's concerned about, though, is truth. Now, his first general argument is this: it's either clever or just clever. He claims that relativism is self-refuting in the following way. Relativism is the view that all opinions are equally good. There is no objective truth. But he says, if all opinions are equally good, then the opinion that relativism is false is true. So if it's true that relativism is false, then it's false. But if it's not true, then relativism is false. So if relativism is true, it's false, and if it's false, it's false. So it's got to be false. Now, this is either logically effective or a clever trick. Now, as you might imagine, clever relativists say Plato is just playing a trick, because they can say relativism is true, and that it's the only truth, that all the truths are relative. But it does have a certain appeal, because if you're going to say that there is no truth, how do you say that you're true about there is no truth? There has to be at least one truth. And so Plato says, haha, you can't be a relativist. So he thinks it just self-destructs. And then he's satisfied. It's like, one and done. Now, he does bring up a second argument that's not a general one. So it doesn't work against all relativists, but here's what he argues. Socrates is arguing about Protagoras. Protagoras was a sophist who charged for his classes. And so Socrates says, well, if Protagoras is charging for his classes, Protagoras has to say that what he's teaching is better than someone else's. Because if all opinions are equally good, it makes no sense to pay someone for an opinion when yours is just as good. If you can get anybody's opinion for your own for free. So if he's going to charge people, he has to justify charging, which means he has to say that his opinions are better. So that would be self-defeating. Now again, this doesn't refute relativism in general, but it is a particular shot at those who would charge for it. I mean, a relativist could say, yeah, Protagoras shouldn't be charging for that because no opinion is better than the others, but it's a good shot at Protagoras. So to his satisfaction, he believes that he's shown that relativism is not true. So then that's done. So then he moves on to kind of the main venue, which is going after the senses. Now, Plato is not going to claim that the senses are useless, that you should do the bird box thing and put blindfolds on and stuff. Not going to claim that. I don't think there's any connection between Plato and the bird box challenge. It's just weird to see people run around blindfolds. And people doing that challenge. Some people do that challenge every day. People who are blind, they're doing that challenge literally every day. So what's the first problem of the senses? And he really goes after this. And again, this is kind of a very core battle in epistemology. Namely, when you're knowing stuff about the world, can you know stuff through your senses, or can you not? And Plato says, you can't. Here's one. His first problem is change. The world, as he notes, following our good dead friend Heraclitus, the world constantly changes. Now, Plato was being influenced by two dead thinkers. Heraclitus is, well, lots of cool quotes, but his signature quote is, "The world is fire," which he means literally and metaphorically. Literally, he believed the world was made of fire, because the Greek elements, earth, air, fire, water. Heraclitus believed it was all fire. And he believed the world was constantly, metaphorically speaking, also fire because it constantly changed. Which leads to his second signature quote, which is, "You can never step into the same river twice." Which is not just about rivers, it's about everything changes, nothing stays the same. Now, Plato found that appealing. So he believed that Heraclitus was right about this world. Nothing stays the same, constant change. Now, because of this, because the world is constantly changing, you can never be certain about the world through your senses. All your senses can do is report to you that at a certain time, things looked a certain way. So they can't be a source of knowledge because, first, there's a time factor. You can't know something because if you're no longer seeing it, hearing it, touching it, you no longer know. For example, if you have a car or vehicle, when you left it, was it on fire? No. Is it on fire now? You don't. Unless you get like a sensor linked to your phone, you don't know. Probably not, but you don't know. Because when you left it, it wasn't on fire, maybe, but now you're not looking at it. So who knows what's going on? Yeah, so he's right. If you're not actually looking at it, you don't know. Secondly, even if you are actually looking at it, you're only going with the appearance. You still don't know for sure. I mean, again, going with the example, I mean, your car probably wasn't visibly on fire, but maybe there was a fire starting somewhere in the engine. Not to worry anybody. Better run back, check your car. It's okay. That bad professor scaring me with my car. Yeah, so all we can have is how things look now. Now, later thinkers like Descartes will see in the future, he really ran with that. He just like takes that and runs off into total skepticism. So because of change, Plato says your senses can't give you knowledge because all they can say is, it looks this way to me now. But of course, maybe I'm wrong in what I'm seeing. And of course, as soon as I'm not looking, things could totally change. Now, Aristotle disagreed with him here. Aristotle said things could change, but you could still know. Because he says you don't, to know something doesn't mean you have to know it and it always stays the same. You could know something, but then it could change. So you could know that when you left your car, it wasn't on fire. What's it doing now? Don't know. But you do know it wasn't on fire when you left it. And he says that's still knowledge. And it's too much to expect that you would know things that you can't see. Because Aristotle is more empirical than Plato. Second problem, definitions. Now, Plato believed, and a big part of the debate about epistemology, or anything, is what is your kind of objective or goal? Like, for example, in epistemology, the question would be, what do you when you're trying to argue, can you know stuff through the senses? A big part of that would be, what is knowledge? Because depending on what you take knowledge to be, that tells you whether you can know it through the senses or not. To use an analogy, outside of philosophy, think of trying to determine if something works as border security, like a wall or not. And what you need to do is know, like, what is your objective? What are you trying to do? Because depending on your purpose, it may be effective or not. I mean, to illustrate, if our concern is with people seeking asylum, then the wall wouldn't make sense. Because the people seeking asylum, they want to be found. They're coming here to seek asylum. You'd be better off just setting up like a big sign, like, come here. here's our checkpoint. If you're dealing with drug smugglers, the wall wouldn't help because you're not going to walk across the desert carrying lots of drugs. You put them in a car and drive them across the checkpoints. But if you're concerned about people who are coming across the desert, on their own, then maybe the wall of like a border thing would be more effective. So you need to know what am I trying to do? Now for Plato, he claims knowledge requires something universal and unchanging. Now this could be disputed against, but that's what he claims. So because of this, he thinks that the senses are not going to help us here. Why not? Well, part of this, and part of why he thinks we need unchanging stuff, is because of definitions. He claims that if we didn't have unchanging definitions, we didn't have language, nailed down, so to speak, language would not work. Now, on one hand, does that seem right? Well, let's imagine a silly game. Imagine if you play this game where you take some cards of common words and you draw like a bunch of them, and then you draw more cards with new meanings and you put them down. And everybody in the game got like different sets of meanings for the words, and you had to follow those rules. Now, would it be hard to talk to people if the meaning of common words kept changing? Yeah, because you'd say like, let's go to lunch. And suppose the new meaning was, I'm gonna kill you. That would be, or lunch is like murder. You'd be like, well, I don't want to go to that lunch. Yeah, and so if we didn't have fixed meanings, we'd have no idea what people meant. Like the word meanings constantly change. So on one hand, he's kind of right. But on the other hand, do definitions change? Yeah, I mean, a good example would be like slang terms. If you look back at the history of slang, some of it sticks around. Like some words get embedded for a long time, but others, intentionally they're created so people can talk without those old people know what it's saying. Yeah, and so those change over time. And many words, like what words mean. Some words are, if you go back and read like old comics or old stories, there are words that are perfectly innocuous then that are ironically pretty vulgar now. It's like, wow, they put that in a book? It's like, yeah, it meant something totally different then. And likewise, there are things we say now which would have been totally offensive back then. Yeah, so maybe it might be that it's not that language can't change, but it's going to change slowly enough so you know what's going on. So he does kind of a point. If language could just float free with no connections, we'd have no idea what people meant. But of course, he's also kind of wrong because language does change. So maybe kind of weak. His third sense argument is pretty interesting and has moved from being kind of theoretical to actually pretty practical today. And here's the original argument. Plato noted that we seem to know perfect stuff. A good example would be geometry would be an excellent example. In geometry, we are of course dealing with perfect geometric objects. Planes that are perfectly two-dimensional, perfect circles, perfect triangles, perfect squares. But if we try to actually create them, draw a perfect circle, will it be perfect? No, even if we used like a laser printer, like a 1200 per inch laser printer, and if you took out a magnifying glass, you'd still see imperfections. It would also be printed on paper, so it would still be more than 2 dimensions because the ink has some thickness. Yeah, and so we know that our geometric creations are imperfect. And if we take things like justice, right? We have no perfect justice here, or perfect beauty. But we have the concept of perfect justice, perfect beauty. And so what he reasons is this. We have concepts of perfect things, but all the stuff we encounter, the physical things, always fall short. Even the best printed circle is still imperfect, still, three-dimensional. The most beautiful person is still flawed. They're not perfectly beautiful. Any trial is still not perfect justice. So what he claims is, since we know about perfection, he claims, and we don't see it here, it can't come from the senses, because we've never seen perfect anything. So the only way we can have a notion of perfection is through some other means than our senses, or so he claims. Now, a counter-argument would be that we could somehow extrapolate to perfection. Like we don't see it, but we kind of like to use an analogy. Like if you see, we can't see like infinite distance, but we can kind of mentally imagine like really long distances. Just keep at it. Or another objection could be, or another counter could be, we really don't understand perfection. We say the words perfect beauty, perfect justice, but we don't really get it. To use an analogy, think of infinity. We talk about infinity all the time. Well, not all the time, we talk about it. But do we really understand infinity? Now, we got the word, and interestingly, there are actually different sizes of infinity. It sounds weird, but there are. Why? Well, suppose you just take whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. How many of them are there? Infinite. Now, if you add in fractions, how many of those are there? Infinite. But there's more fractions than whole numbers, so the infinity of those is bigger than the infinity of whole numbers. Then if you throw in negative numbers too, so you get all these different sizes of infinity because there are different sets of numbers, but they're all infinite. But one infinity is bigger than another. When I first heard that, I thought, people are just making stuff up. But technically it's right, they're all infinite, but it's more infinite than another. Now, one area where this has actually hit the real world is this problem. When we're engineering stuff, we've reached the point now where we're working at like the nano level. Like think of like the processor in your laptop, phone, etc. That's at submicroscopic level. And what we ran into is the problem of measuring stuff. Now, when we were building, before this sort of microengineering, you measure stuff like in inches and quarter inches and so forth. So if you're a little off in making a table, you're not going to notice it. Or like a building this size. But here's the problem. When we're working at that tiny, tiny level, we needed very exact measurements. And so being off by a little bit is a problem. And one of the basic problems is standardizing measurement. So for example, how do you know when a foot is really a foot? Well, you need a ruler to measure your ruler. And you got to know that your ruler is accurate and not changing, not shrinking or growing. Now, they used to use a physical meter bar there's actually an international agreements on measurements and stuff. And there was a meter bar that was made of a special metal, stored in a special gas. And then they realized that the bar, even though it was stored in special gas, etc., was affected by gravity and so forth. So it actually wasn't a perfect meter because it would change because it's a physical object. Then they switched to a wavelength of light, and then they realized that's got problems too because it's also matter. And so we're actually running into a practical application of Plato's problem. Namely, our engineering is now so precise, we are running into the limits of physical imperfection. Because the world is imperfect, we can't, it gives us a bound to our engineering. We can only make chips so small because matter is imperfect. It's limited, it changes. And so in a way, Plato is an interesting result. Yeah, we really can't do this stuff because we'll run into limitations of imperfection. And so we'll probably need to have we probably already have an abstract concept of a meter. It's not a physical object anymore. It is going to be like a platonic abstraction. And we're in the same problem with things like weights, etc. So Plato 1,000 years ago was aware of this problem of today, that imperfection is linear engineering. Okay, so that brings us in the stuff for today. Next time we'll finish up with why knowledge isn't just being right, and then on to more stuff.